A sound mind in a sound body. Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks. This series covers major philosophers and core texts in the history of ideas, especially the great classics, which are classics for a reason. For each, I've selected an excerpt, no more than an hour, sometimes as short as 20 minutes or so, and an introduction to an important work, and we will give it a close reading with accompanying text. Now, some thoughts concerning education by the great early modern philosopher John Locke, and this work is absolutely essential to know for the establishment of the liberal education ideal. Let's go to the text. All right, let's start at the beginning. The title is Some Thoughts Concerning Education, and there's some emphasis on some thoughts. Locke doesn't intend this to be a complete and thorough treatise on the subject, and certainly not something that's to be followed mechanically. Initially written in 1690 as a personal correspondence with some advice, but then due to its length and its popularity as it was informally circulated, it was published in 1693. Now, section 1, strong opening. A sound mind in a sound body is a short but full description of a happy state in this world. I'm going to pause there and unpack that some. Already fighting words, if we know something about the history of education and the then prevalent models of education. One thing is this sound mind in a sound body, a theme of philosophical integration. The old mind-body problem. What's the relationship between our minds and our bodies, or our souls and our physical capacities, and so on? And what Locke is indicating is that he is not a dualist. Much of philosophical dualism had assumed that the soul and the body were different things with different aspirations, and in many cases in conflict with each other. An implication of that had often been that the mind or the soul was more important than the body, and perhaps even that we should neglect the body. And all of that then had implications for education, that education is about developing the mind and not necessarily the body. Perhaps we're going to neglect the body altogether and just focus on theoretical, intellectual, abstract, soul character development, and all of those sorts of things. So what Locke is signaling right off the bat is that the mind and the body should be integrated. Perhaps they should be a unity, that the language that we are now familiar with in the modern world, that we are integrating the whole person with all that that implies. Locke is strongly on that side of the divide. Next, I've highlighted here the word happy. And that also is fighting words against the common idea that education should be a duty or an obligation, or that we should expect to be bored or to be a painful process. And then more broadly speaking, that life is about duties and obligations and suffering in order to sacrifice for whatever one is supposed to be sacrificing for. Again, Locke, and partly this is why we consider him modern, is indicating happiness as the normative ideal or the goal to be striven for. And then education is going to be to prepare people to lead happy lives, not lives of suffering, sacrifice, duty, obligation, and so forth. And then finally, I've highlighted the words this world. Again, fighting words in the sense that Locke is saying, not necessarily that there isn't another world, a higher world, a supernatural world, and so forth. Perhaps there is, and Locke is a kind of religious philosopher, but nonetheless, our concerns here are with this world, the natural world, the physical world. We don't need to get into the ontology debates too much right now. Second, I've flagged this sentence: men's happiness or misery is most part of their own making. Again, a strong theme indicating that we have some agency, some control, some volition, some power over our lives, and not only some, but mostly how we end up in this world is as a result of how we exercise the control, power, agency that we have. And again, Locke is right off the beginning indicating his disagreement with what are the prevailing deterministic views, that human beings are pawns or puppets or pushed around by forces beyond their control, and that perhaps it's all a matter of luck, or mostly a matter of luck, what one's estate ends up being in life. We might be pushed around by physical forces or social forces or divine forces or the fates, this position argues. And so as a result of that, whether we're happy or sad or whatever, not really up to us. Locke very much on the other side of that debate. We have much control over it. Then he goes on to even put a sort of statistic to it in the next line that I've flagged. I think I may say that of all the men we meet with, 9 parts of 10 are what they are, good or evil, useful or not, by their education. So it's not that we are fated or destined one way or the other. Our education, and when we know more about Locke, self-education and the decisions that we make with respect to our own learning is going to be the lion's share of where we end up. Okay, moving on to section 2. I've just got one part flagged here. Often treatises in education or remarks on education, institutions of education, would neglect physicality particularly in the medieval world and much of even the ancient world, and assume that education, formal education, is about the mind or the soul. And so the education remarks would immediately go to discussion of those and not have much to say about the body. Locke here is indicating that he is going to start with the body, the health of the body. And then in section 3, he gives us his reason for that, how necessary health is to our business and happiness. What are the purposes of life? Well, we have to go out and make a business of some sort. And we need to pursue happiness, and health is absolutely foundational to that, Locke is saying. And so that's where we are going to start. There is in part a developmental point that Locke is going to be stressing throughout his thoughts concerning education, that rather than just considering, say, an infant or a child as a full human being just scaled down, that rather we go through developmental phases, and that what we need to be attending to at those different developmental phases varies according to the stage. And so indicating in part, we'll see a little bit more of this later, that babies, while of course they do have some mental or psychological faculties that are being developed, primarily it is physical health concerns that parents and other educators, tutors, maids, governesses, and so on will need to be attending to. Section 43, I'm going to jump to, because he goes through long discussions about nutrition and rest and dress and so on. And very important theme that's characteristically Lockean and becomes more prominent as modern education develops. Where I've indicated here, I am very apt to think that great severity of punishment does but very little good, nay, great harm in education. And I believe it will be found that ceteris paribus, the Latin meaning holding everything else constant or the same, those children who have been most chastised seldom make the best men. And again, strong fighting words for Locke, the philosopher here, contrasting the widely prevalent views of parenting and education, that we need to be strict with children, we need to punish them frequently, not only shaming types of psychological punishment, but also physical punishment, corporal punishment, spanking, hitting them with sticks, and the assumption there being that it is primarily through those negative methods that we are going to keep children focused on the proper things and following the correct path. Locke arguing the opposite of that is going to be emphasizing the positive, the healthy rather than the painful, the pleasurable, and this is one of the things that is going to make him a modern in contrast to the ancient spare the rod and spoil the child type of thinking. And in part, he's making an empirical point. Look at people who have been punished a lot, who've had very strict parenting. He's going to be making the claim here that empirically it shows that they will not be the ones that turn out to be the best men. Now, there is, of course, a natural follow-up question. If we are not considering children as little monsters, I'm overstating perhaps, but not from some philosophers' perspective, who need to be trained and controlled, and just all of this badness is inside them waiting to get out if we don't beat it out of them. How are children going to learn to be good people, to have good manners, as Locke suggests here at the beginning of section 67. And so what Locke here is arguing in the section I've flagged here is to say, well, how do we learn manners? In effect, he's going to argue that children are not quite little scientists, that might be putting it a little strongly for the time period, but they are empirical, they are observers, and they are imitators. They learn by watching and imitating what those around them do. So manners, I think, are rather to be learned by example than rules. And then children, if kept out of ill company, will take a pride to behave themselves prettily, after the fashion of others, perceiving themselves esteemed and commended for it. So the idea here then is you are a parent, you are a governess, you are a teacher of some sort, you are a tutor. Set a good example. Don't be one of those people who says things like, do what I say, not what I do. The Locke is indicating here it's not a matter of rules, giving children a list of rules and then smacking them whenever they don't follow one of the rules or break it. You, whatever the principles are, whatever the rules are, you live by them. Children will be observing you and observing you carefully. And to the extent that they respect you, love you, admire you, they will want to be like you, and they will practice emulating, and then it will become habitual for them. And then, of course, rather than just giving them a bunch of rules with implied threats, set a good example, and then when the child rather follows, well, praise the child for having done so. That's how children will learn their manners. Again, much more modern to developments of parenting and education. Now, an interesting point here in section 67, Locke has gone on for many pages now, and he's not yet gotten to what we would recognize as a formal curriculum with a list of subjects that students ought to be learning, and many treatises and manuals on education and parenting will plunge right into, here are the 10 subjects or the 15 subjects or the 8 subjects, and these are the important ones and the less important ones, and here's how you teach them. Locke's not done any of that, and he's already 67, some of them substantial sections into his rights here. And what's interesting to me, I remember the first time I read this, was that the very first thing that Locke mentions as a formal education or curricular element is here, dancing. And I remember being surprised by that. But the reasons why Locke suggests dancing and recommends dancing as the first thing are very characteristically Lockean and fitting very much with that theme of sound mind and sound body, the integration theme. So let's read it here. Nothing appears to me to give children so much becoming confidence and behavior, and so to raise them to the conversation of those above their age as dancing. I think they should be taught to dance as soon as they are capable of learning it. Okay, now that's interesting. So what he's saying here is we're going to be teaching children the ability to dance whenever that is. So we'd have to say, well, they can crawl, and then they can pull themselves around and toddle around, and then they can start to walk. At some point they have the capacity for full physical control and to move their bodies in a rhythmic fashion. And that's the point, whenever that is, that they should start to learn how to dance. And it's interesting as he goes on to say, and he says he's puzzled by this, for though this consists only in outward gracefulness of motion, yet I know not how it gives children manly thoughts and carriage more than anything. This is a very interesting point. So what he's saying here is if we train the body and we train the movement of the body, we give the person how to stand up like an adult, how to have your shoulders back, how to keep your eyes up, not to be a sloucher and a person who just kind of randomly moves around. Practice the positions, practice the movements, the ones that one learns in dance. And so one has then a more adult carriage. And then he says that somehow this also affects the mind and gives one more adult thoughts, that somehow the body is causing the mind to behave a certain way. And of course, there's going to be a regularity and a dignity and a gracefulness to the physical movement, and those will be communicated. One will have dignified and graceful thinking. And of course, there's also going to be a social component to it. If we introduce other little children, suppose, now the boy is to ask the girl to dance. Well, part of the dancing lesson is going to be, how do you approach? How do you introduce yourself? How do you say pleasant things? How do you invite the person? And then when you are engaging in the dance, how do you interact with other people in a graceful, mannered way? And so then we are, as well as teaching the physical education, also teaching psychological and social education values. And then an interesting other remark toward the end of section 67 about Locke's more modern cast of mind, where he says, quote, "Never trouble yourself about those faults in them which you know age will cure." So again, children are going to be children. They're going to go through various developmental stages. And of course, they're going to make mistakes and screw ups and do all sorts of inappropriate things at various age levels. What's interesting about this to me is Locke's attitude toward that. And again, in contrast to many traditional and classical models of raising children, which would be to assume that children are bad. Perhaps they have a very strong form of sinfulness in them. They are unruly. And what you need to do as a parent and teacher is be very vigilant and on the outlook for any signs of misbehavior, and then pounce on them very harshly and make sure that the child learns the lesson through tough tones of voice and perhaps even physical smacking, that's not appropriate. And what Locke is suggesting here is a much more relaxed notion. Yes, kids are going to be kids, but he has a more benevolent understanding of how children are going to grow out of. So of doing various childish things. So don't sweat the small stuff; they will grow out of it, and then perhaps just focus your energies on keeping them inside the rails whenever they are getting outside on the bigger and more dangerous things. All right, jumping ahead to another 80 sections or so to 148, where Locke starts to get more systematic about curricular elements. And here at 148, after talking about learning languages and formal full sentences rather, and how to have dialogues with other people, Locke suggests it's only after children are able to talk that they start to be able to learn to read. Now, of course, their vocal cords in their mouths and their motor controls involved there are developing when they start to babble at several months, and some children start to speak words, perhaps 8, 9, 10 months when they are early, perhaps on average around a year, and then they progress rather to phrases, and then to full sentences, and then to longer dialogues with other people. But it's only at the point Locke is suggesting that they have the capacity for speaking that they learn to be able to read. And so this was probably going to be ages 2, ages 3. Again, this will be a matter for some judgment call depending on the individual child. But it's interesting how once again Locke comes back to this theme of punishment, teaching by means of the stick as opposed to teaching by means of the carrot, or emphasizing the positive rather than the negative. So in the context of talking about reading lessons and so on, he again returns to this theme. Great care is to be taken that it never be made as a business to him, nor he look on it as a task. So again, this emphasis that we shouldn't be making education and learning into a negative thing. Now, people have different conceptions of work. Some people love their work, some people hate their work, but there is this very common notion out there that work is something that is a little bit unsavory. You don't want to do it. You do it because you have to. And Locke is here suggesting, not just suggesting, but emphasizing strongly that it should not be anything like that. It should be fun. It should be a pleasure, and we need to introduce it in a way that makes it that way. And what's then very interesting is Locke, the great liberal philosopher, coming out strongly in this next phrase, arguing that the liberty that we prize as human beings is a human fundamental. It goes all the way down to something deep in our human nature, our capacity and need to make our own choices in life. So, carrying on this quotation, we naturally, as I said, even from our cradles, love liberty, and have therefore an aversion to many things for no other reason but because they are enjoined us. Tell someone they have to do it, even if it's a good idea, even if they, if they had independently come up with it and thought this is a good idea. If you tell them that they have to do it and you try to make them do it, then their natural human reaction, and this is a healthy reaction, is to say, I don't want to do that. So what we need to do as parents and as teachers is work with this natural human element of our nature, the choice-making capacity, and develop that, not fight against it. And then, immediately following a point about benevolence and fun, I have always had a fancy that learning might be a play and recreation to children, and that they might be brought to desire to be taught if it were proposed to them as a thing of honor, credit, delight, and recreation. And notice that he puts this as a fancy, as a fantasy, that I've kind of got this fantasized notion of what education could be, and the learning to read in particular. And it's interesting because here he is signaling the very common notion that even we moderns know, that when we think about school and we think about education, our shoulders slump. We start to think of it as this place, oh man, that is so boring. That is so, in many cases, even dehumanizing. I hate school. And that is very common in Locke's era, such that he says that this is the idea that it could be anything other than that just is a fantasy that I have. But nonetheless, I think there is, I being Locke now, something to this, and we need to explore this and perhaps even revolutionize how we teach education. Go in with the idea that it should be play, that it should be fun, it should be recreation. We know there's lots of people who love learning. They love reading. They love to expand. And most children seem to delight in developing their bodies and minds. And so how can we do the more formal parts of schooling and education that works with that, rather than beating that down, suppressing it, and perhaps even eliminating it entirely from the child. So he carries on in the next section. Children may be cozened into a knowledge of the letters, be taught to read without perceiving it to be anything but a sport, and play themselves into that which others are whipped for. And then he goes on to say, making a developmental point, children should not have anything like work in that sense of being laid on them, stuff that you have to do, or serious laid on them. Neither their minds nor their bodies will bear it. They're not yet developed enough for it. It injures their healths, and they're being forced and tied down to their books. All right, strongly on that point then of play, fun, recreation, particularly in early childhood, and education and learning becoming something positive than something negative. All right, a section on memory training. We work on the body. We are working on speaking. We are working on reading. We also have memory faculties, and Locke turns to saying we should definitely train the memory faculties, and he suggests some content here, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the Ten Commandments. It's good for people to learn these things, but to learn them as a matter of memory, learn them perfectly by heart, and having them spoken to him and repeating them. Next, reading English and what happens after we have first learned to speak, then we learn how to read. He then says, once we know how to read well, then it is, and only then should we start to teach writing. Again, this theme of developmentalism. So when would that be? Well, again, this is going to be a judgment call. We start to learn how to speak, perhaps around year 1. Then we're going to be in a position to learn how to read, perhaps, say, around year 3. At what point are our fingers and manual dexterity developed enough, and also our minds are developed enough to be able to have the eye-hand coordination and to know what we are writing, perhaps 4 or 5. Judgment call, but again, the developmental point. Next, formal curriculum language, second language. As soon as he can speak English, it is time for him to learn some other language. And this nobody doubts of when French is proposed. And it's interesting here, again, Locke entering into a debate about not only just foreign languages or second and third languages, but which one they should be. And much of classical and traditional education, whether religious or secular, will say that that second language should be Latin, right? Or that second language should be Greek, or that second language should be, say, Hebrew. And the argument there is that all of the important works are written in the language of the ancients. If we are strongly religious, for example, we will say our religious text is written in Hebrew, right? Or if we're from further east, we might say it is written in Arabic, right? Or the New Testament is written in Aramaic, I believe, parts of it, and so substantially in Greek. And so, if we want to have all of the important knowledge transmitted to children, and all of those important knowledge items of knowledge are captured in texts, then to get as close to those texts as possible, it's the ancient languages that we should read. Or we might be less religious, but nonetheless, I believe that all of the great and important knowledge has been discovered by the ancients. It was the ancient Greeks, or it was the Romans. And so what we should be doing is giving children the tools to be able to access the great works that are in Latin and in Greek. Locke is a modern, and he's not against the idea that there's lots of things that have been discovered and we can learn profitably from the ancients, but at the same time he is arguing and believes there's a huge amount that we do not know yet, and that so scientific developments, and this is now in the early days of science, that we should be open to the new works in whatever language that is being written in, and also the idea that much of the material that is in those ancient texts is wrong, and we should be willing as moderns to challenge and set aside many of the so-called truths that have been handed down to us that have now been revealed to be falsehoods. But it's not just the classical knowledge that Locke is interested in. He is very much a modern in the sense that he is interested in practical life. England at this point has become a democratic republic, and with a much wider spread voting, and that we are training young people to grow up to be voting citizens, and so they're going to be knowledgeable about what's going on in the world. And so if we look at what's going on in the world, we need to look at, say, the other political powers that are out there. And England is pretty important, but also the French and the Spanish are very important. Plus also the English are a nation of traders and going to become even more so, and explorers. And their nearest trading partner partners across the channel are the French. And so what Locke is then much more focused on when we're deciding about what the second language should be is what's practical, what's useful, what are the living languages that are most prevalent out in the world and going to therefore be most profitable for young Englishmen and English girls increasingly to learn. And so this is what he signals in the middle part of this paragraph. French is a living language, and for that reason he's going to give precedence to it over any of the ancient languages. Now then, a list in section 178 of some more formal curriculum elements: arithmetic, geography, chronology, history, and geometry 2. And then he devotes sections to each of those, but then notice what we are interested in is all things that are practical, useful about this real world. We're not interested in the ancient Egyptians and their mummification techniques. We also notice that there's not very much by way of formal theological treatises reading ancient religious texts and so forth. He does believe as part of moral training, the Lord's Prayer and the various commandments and so on. But much of the curriculum here, as we can see, are all things that are practical, useful about this world, the natural world, and the natural human social world. If we go through geography, we're going to be having people vote democratically. Well, they need to know where things are around the world. And so if there is some event that is occurring in North Africa or the Middle East or over in Russia, well, where are these places? And so we can vote more reliably on foreign policy issues. Or if we are having an increasing number of young English people who are merchants and traders and trading all over the world, well, knowing where places are around the world, how you can get there, how long it takes, and so on. So geography and chronology, the study of time, history and all of the lessons of the disasters and the successes of history, and then the people who are the heroes and the villains of history. All of these are practical life lessons as well. Arithmetic for sums and debits and credits and keeping track of one's books as a modern business person and managing one's household finances. And so we see, for example, in section 180, arithmetic is of such general use in all parts of life and business. So absolutely it should be on the curriculum. History teaches so many political lessons, moral lessons, and so we need to learn a lot of history, but also history is just so much fun. Notice that nothing delights more than history. And then we're getting toward the end of the thoughts concerning education. I believe there's 216 sections altogether, but I did want to, before we close, go to section 194, which I found striking, particularly the first time I read it. One thing that's interesting when you read through Locke's curriculum is what's not on the curriculum. And while Locke is a modern, he's an empiricist, he's a believer in the development of rationality and a contributor to the developments of modern scientific method, there isn't much that we would recognize by means of science in Locke's formal curriculum. Chemistry, biology, physics, astronomy, and so forth. And the reason for that is kind of interesting. So one of the things that he signals then is he's kind of aware of this, even though there's lots of activity going on in those areas, is that the way he puts it here is, though the systems of physics that I have met with afford little encouragement to look for certainty or science. So what he's doing is commenting on the state of physics in his era, that he's looked at it, he's a smart guy, he's educated, and it's not that impressive. Astronomy has not yet significantly separated itself out from astrology. Chemistry has not yet significantly separated itself out from alchemy. The practice of medical science, and Locke himself trained as a medical doctor, is this witch's brew of old wives' tales, apologies to old wives, and crazy mystical things that have just come down from various texts. So what Locke is signaling here is he's looked at what's going on in these fields, and it's not very encouraging. And so until it becomes better grounded and we have something closer to certainty in these disciplines, he's not going to include it in his curriculum. Now, he is signaling, though, that he's open to the inclusion of these things. The curriculum is not going to be something fixed in stone. We're going to keep things frozen at whatever 1690s level knowledge is. Locke is very much open to the idea that there's huge amounts that we still need to figure out. And as we figure out more things and more disciplines, then we will add those to the curriculum. And so it's interesting then as he goes on to mention Isaac Newton in this context. These thoughts concerning education are written in 1690, and Newton's great work on the Principia Mathematica had just been published a few years earlier, 1787, I believe. Don't quote me on that. And everybody who's interested in the natural sciences is talking about this Newton fellow. And so Newton certainly mentions is worthy of a mention here from Locke's perspective. The incomparable Mr. Newton, with his mathematics applied to some parts of nature, seems to have made great progress in making the incomprehensible universe a little more comprehensible. And he goes on to mention the book. But then what he is saying, this is still early days. The really smart people who are really into these issues are now debating this book, and there seems to be a lot of promise, but it's not yet clear what the physicists are going to make in the final analysis of Mr. Newton's work. And then he goes on to indicate part of one of the reasons for that. He says, though there are very few that have mathematics enough to understand his demonstration. So it's early days yet. Let's follow with interest what's going on. And then if there is something to this new Newtonian physical system, then of course we will add physics to the curriculum. All right, jumping to the concluding section. Though I am now come to a conclusion, and then Locke indicates, again, a very characteristic Lockean and modern way of thinking about knowledge and education. He's not setting himself up as some sort of religious guru or some sort of philosopher genius who's descending from his mountain cave and is laying a whole bunch of truths on you, and he wants you to just follow his recipe and perhaps be a more slavish intellectual follower. He's indicating very strongly in the concluding section that is not what schooling and education should be about. I would not have it thought that I look on it as a just treatise on this subject. There are 1,000 other things that may need consideration. Right, so this is just the beginning, just some suggestions, and take them as such. And then he goes on to indicate, especially if one should take in the various tempers, different inclinations, and particular defaults that are to be found in children, and prescribe proper remedies. So not only are children going through various developmental phases, Locke is signaling as an individualist. Every child is an individual, a unique individual, and proper parenting, proper schooling, and proper education more broadly is going to take into account the individual uniqueness and be tailored to the individuality of each child. And here Locke is signaling, again, another disagreement, a deep disagreement with the prevailing model of education that says, in effect, we have a template that is more or less fixed in stone, and we take the child and we fit the child into the template. We make the student conform to the rigid template. In this case, what Locke is doing is saying, I've got some very general, open-ended things here. You take those and you fit them to the individual student. And that takes education in a very different directions. Carrying on this theme, he repeats it in the middle of the paragraph, but having had here only some general views in reference to the main and aims of education. Right, this is a very general, open-ended treatise. And then again, a little bit later, though this be far from being a complete treatise on this subject, or such as that everyone may find what will just fit his child in it. Again, not yet complete. We all have a lot more work to do as parents and as teachers. Yet, the concluding clause here, it may give some small light to those whose concern for their dear little ones makes them so irregularly bold that they dare venture to consult their own reason in the education of their children rather than wholly to rely upon old custom. And again, some strong fighting words in those passages as well. Our children are dear to us. Parenting is not some obligation, and all these little brats, the mouths to feed, and we have to do something with them, or even teaching as a duty and an obligation to enlighten the little blighters. And I'm just doing it for the good of right, whatever, and I'm not getting any particular pleasure. We care about our children. Our motivation should be love, caring, and we want to have a delightful relationship with our children, including parenting and teaching. And then he goes on then to indicate that this then means that you should think of yourself as a rational person. And use your own reason, use your own judgment. Again, pushing it a little bit that in being a parent and a teacher, you are a kind of scientist, and you're going to be doing a lot of observing and a lot of experimenting and trial and error and judgment call. And what if we do this and what if we do that? So behave in that fashion in the education of one's children. Follow their developmental stages. Tailor things to each individual child's. What weaknesses do I especially need to work on? What natural strengths or interests does the child have that I can emphasize and facilitate? And again, the closing words here are strong. Rather than to rely wholly upon old custom. I'm not particularly interested in customary ways of doing education. The fact that it's a tradition, that we've been doing it this way, that it's written down in some dusty old book, that doesn't matter. It might be true, but you have to look at it, make your own rational judgment call, try it out with your child if you think it's an experiment worth doing so, but if not, set it aside and try something new.